Hi, I'm Amy O'Donnell on behalf of Bernina World of Sewing in Raleigh and Wilmington, North Carolina. And here we are at month 5 of the Feathered Friends Quilt Along. How amazing is that? This month we're going to be adding a quantity of 40 3.5-inch square 9-patch blocks around the ever expanding center block that we've been making. This month we're going to be using 3 of our fabrics: the background fabric, the dark fabric, and the light medium fabric. This month's assignment is very chain piecing friendly, so we're going to be using a lot of our Blade Saver thread cutter if you have one. These are just so great to be able to cut those pieces apart so quickly. We're also going to be needing our portable design board, because once we get these 9-patch blocks made, we want to lay them out in the right order and keep them in the right order till we get them sewn together. We're also going to need our 24-inch quilting ruler, because we are doing another spacing border and more spacing blocks this month too, so we're going to need that. And this month's assignment is also stripology friendly, so if you have a stripology ruler, this is a great time to use that too. Let me check here. Like I said, we're going to be doing another spacing border and spacing blocks. And we also want to make sure that we shorten our stitch length again this month, because we're going to be piecing these 9 patches, strip piecing, and then we're going to be cutting them up. So we want those stitches to be really secure. So I would set my stitch length maybe at 1.8 to 2.0, because we don't want those stitches coming undone. But that's all I have to tell you. So now we're ready to get started. So hang on, and here we go. Here's what we're going to be doing this month. Here's a picture of the finished product after we attach our 40 3.5-inch square 9-patch blocks around the border of our quilt. If you've noticed, I made my spacing border a little bit wider than prescribed in the pattern, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. Here's how we'll be cutting our background fabric into 1.5-inch strips for the 9-patch units. 4 2-inch strips are going to be for the spacing borders, and the 3.5 by 5 pieces are for the spacing blocks. If you're going to leave your spacing borders a little bit wider, like I did last month and I'm going to do this month, then I would hold off on cutting those spacing bars until the end. From our dark and light medium fabrics, we're going to be cutting 1.5-inch strips. And you can see that the stripology ruler is really handy for cutting these 1.5-inch strips efficiently. If not, use your regular quilting ruler too, it'll work great. And then you sew your strip sets together as described in the pattern, in the printed instructions, and press toward the dark fabric. Now it's time to lay out your strip sets so that we can cut them into the pieces that we need to make our 9-patch blocks. Lay them right sides together with the seams nesting. Since we've pressed toward the dark, those seams should nest quite nicely. A 1/4-inch accurate seam is very important. Now I laid my strip sets under my stripology ruler, and if you're not using a stripology ruler, your regular quilting ruler will be fine. And I'm cutting into 1.5-inch strips. And now I've got all my 1.5-inch strips cut, and I'm laying out my first 9-patch blocks. I'm using a chain piecing method to stitch these pieces together, as you can see. And you want to feel with your finger and make sure that those seams are nested properly. I'm not putting pins in mine, but you can if you want to. I'm certainly not against pinning. And here the chain piecing continues. And now I've got my 9-patch blocks made. And if you notice, I have chosen to press my seams open. And this is a matter of preference, but I've chosen to press my seams open. And you can use your strip stick for this if you have one, so it won't disturb your other seams. And now I've got my 9-patch blocks laid out on my portable design board. And it's really important that you follow the layout that's given in the PDF instructions. And I'm getting ready to sew my blocks together, and you can see I'm lining them up carefully to make sure that my seams are nesting properly. And feel free to place some pins in here to hold everything in place so that nothing shifts while you're doing your sewing together of the seams. And now I've got my 9 patch blocks all laid out and sewn together as prescribed. And there you can see what they look like from the back. This month we are again going to add a spacing border, and then we're going to put spacing blocks in between our 9 patch blocks. So last month when we added the spacing border, the written instructions say to sew the strip onto the quilt and then trim it down to 3/4 of an inch. And it's the same thing that we did last month as this month. She wants us to sew on the 2-inch spacing border and trim it down to 3/4 of an inch. And then when you do that, there's a calculating sheet again included in your instructions on how to position the spacing blocks between your 9 patch blocks to make it all fit onto your quilt. Like last month, I've chosen to make my spacing border slightly larger. And if you do that, your spacing blocks will also have to be slightly larger. So that's why at the beginning of the video, I suggested that if you choose to do that, that you don't cut your spacing blocks till later on. But basically the concept is exactly the same. If you look at this photo, you can see that the center spacing block, or the center group of 9 patch blocks, needs to be centered over your spacing block from last month. So it's kind of it's the same exact concept of what we did last month, but instead of calculating the width of 1 spacing block, we're going to divide that, and it's going to be the width of 2 spacing blocks. Some people got back to me last month with feedback saying that they just ended up eyeballing theirs. So they would put it up on their design wall and they would put all the pieces together after they had trimmed their spacing border and so forth. And they just eyeballed it and add a 1/4 inch seam, and it came out just fine too. So like many things in quilting, there's more than one way to do something. But certainly if you follow the instructions that are in the PDF to do the calculating, or whether you eyeball it, you're going to come out with a good product at the end. But just remember, if you do choose to make your spacing borders wider, like I did, like a 1/2 inch wider, you are going to need to have larger spacing blocks. And then later on in the quilt, when we go to apply our final borders, we will have to trim a little off to make everything fit properly. So I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. I've put my quilt up on the wall after sewing on my spacing border and before trimming it, and this is how I kind of eyeballed it to line things up. This is how I determined how wide I wanted to trim it and how wide I wanted my spacing blocks to be. So this to me works as well as doing the calculation. So I just wanted to show a different method of doing that this time around. In this picture, we have sewn our spacing border onto the quilt, and we are preparing to trim it, either according to the written instructions or to what your preference is. Use your long quilting ruler to trim, to make an even trim along that border. And there you can see in the trimming process again. And here I am sewing on my borders once I determine the size of my spacing blocks. And I'm using lots and lots of pins. You may have to ease it just a little bit, so more pins is better, but keep the pins away from your presser foot. It's my wisdom of the day. And here are the blocks, the 9 patch blocks all sewn on, and you can see there how I pressed my seams. On this one, it was very seam heavy, so I pressed the seam toward my solid border. Obviously, you don't want to be pressing all those seams around. That'd be crazy. And here's our final output. The quilt center continues to grow. So we've added our 9 patch blocks, and we've used the spacing bar technique again and the spacing border technique again. And I hope your quilt turned out, and I hope these instructions were helpful to you. Next month's block is going to be the sawtooth patchwork block. See you then.